Welcome to the Market Mystics podcast. I'm Joshua.
I'm Kim. Let's dive in. What up, Josh?
Hello. Welcome to the show.
I wonder if we could ever get any more awkward with how we start the show.
Yes.
You think so?
I think for sure we could.
Like how? We just say an inappropriate word or something?
No, I just think our pauses could be longer or like, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. Probably maybe it can't get too much worse. Before we jump in, let me ask a question. Okay. So I have this group of I have a small group that I'm in, and one day I asked like an icebreaker question, just because it was like the thing would start and it was so slow, and it was like, man, like, okay, so I just like quickly Googled like icebreaker questions and started asking people questions. And then the next time we met, someone was like, aren't you gonna ask a question? And I was like, oh, I didn't know that was like a thing now. And then like the next time I didn't have one prepared either, and someone else brought it up, and I was like, okay, this is just like a thing. So I don't know if I'll start our podcast every time with an icebreaker question, but I do have one for you today.
Okay.
What's your most used emoji on your phone?
Probably the red heart. I am basic. I am super basic.
I don't feel like mine's definitely not the red heart, but it does also feel like a basic answer because it's just the like crying, laughing emoji. Like that's the number one that I use.
I do use that too. Sometimes I think I overuse the heart. You know how like in the UK, people will end a text with an X, like X's and O's. There's an X like as a smooch. I'm like a red heart, as in like I'm sending this with love. If anything in there sounded harsh, it wasn't. This is sent with love.
Yeah.
The tone is good.
I mean, that's important when you're texting because, are you ready for a segue? That's important when you're texting because you can't listen to the other person. And so they're like, you're working on very limited, you're working on like one layer less of there's several layers less of communication. And so like the emoji or any other things you could put in can be so helpful. Like I used to have a friend who was a very dry texter. And it was so hard to read. Like, do they really like this idea? Are they having fun in this conversation? Are they mad about something? And like, you couldn't really get a read on it. And so like, I remember like seeing that and being like, I never want to be like that. So I just like started trying to be more expressive in my texts. I don't know if it always comes across, but it is my goal.
That's funny. You know, we often have this conversation, but I tend to think 80% of communication is body language. And I think emojis are essentially our text body language.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I've made up that statistic, by the way, but I still kind of think it's accurate.
It can't be too far off.
I don't think it is too far off. I'm losing your segue and I'm really sorry, but quick story. So when we visit our friends in South Africa, their first language is Afrikaans, super fluent in English, probably better than we are. But their first language is Afrikaans.
Right.
And we stay with them in their home. And we have gotten to the point where we can really track along with what they're saying, even though we only know a handful of words in Afrikaans.
Yeah.
But I absolutely believe it's because we pay attention to body language.
Yeah.
We can figure out context. Language. Oh yeah. And they will be shocked. They think that we know Afrikaans. We don't. We just know humans.
Even if you don't, even like we may not be able to say these are the exact words we use, but it'd be like, oh, you were talking about what we're going to do for dinner tonight. And I was like, how did you know that? I was like, just paying attention.
Actually, this is a good segue, though.
It is. It does.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about listening, which seems counterintuitive. And I understand that. But I think listening has more or less to do with your ears and more to do with posture, maybe even a heart posture. And I kind of want to take it in a couple different directions. So, like, one, listening to the Lord, the other, listening to one another. So I don't know. Josh, you have anything to say about that?
Just listening in general. Well, what first came to my mind is, and I think it would apply to listening to the Lord or listening to another human. But I heard somebody talk about this once, and we talked about it just recently in an episode about how like you start with X amount of energy in your day. Maybe it was on the balance conversation. You start with X amount of energy in a day. And if you have an important meeting, like keeping that energy can be really important. And so like they made the comment, like if you have ever zoned out and been bored in a conversation, it's because you didn't have the energy to put into the conversation. And so they were just talking about like stewarding your energy so that you can listen and engage better. And I think that applies to like whether you're talking about another person or the Lord. Like if you've ever like I've experienced this, like tried to sit down and pray after a really long day where it's been like a lot of things going on, and it's so hard for me to like tune in kind of, just because it's like, yeah, I feel like there's not much in the tank. And like sometimes God's super gracious and meets me in that place and it's just beautiful. But sometimes it's like, man, actually what I need in that moment is just sleep, like, or food or something. Like you need something um to connect better. And I think that happens with people all the time. I think we do that probably most to like the people we live with because they're there all the time. And so, they're there at the beginning of the day and they're there at the end of the day. And I'm convinced some people don't start with a full tank. Like I'm convinced that like some people wake up and it's like an hour or 2 hours later that their tank gets full. Because I feel like I've definitely experienced this where like Bree's trying to say something in the morning and I'm just like, I'm not following, I'm not tracking.
I mean, I get that. I think there are morning people. There are people who like naturally wake up with that tank full. I'm like, wake up and need to go to the gas station or something.
Yeah.
It doesn't take long, but like I kind of need to get my wits about me. Um, so I think that's really, really good and insightful. But I also think sometimes, okay, I think sometimes it's really important to have a voice and be heard. But I also think sometimes it's really important to stop talking and listen. And if I go off of the first kind of branch of this, like listening to the Lord, I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in, oh, he's there and I'm here, and that's very ethereal, and this is very physical, and I probably won't hear anything, so I'll just talk, but I believe he's listening. But I think also in any relationship, and this one is not excluded, it like to have a conversation, it has to go back and forth. Right. Like I need to talk at some points and then I need to stop and listen to what you have to say. Right. And I think with the Lord sometimes, even, I mean, I grew up somewhere like the way that I grew up in the faith, it was talk to the Lord and then wait for something to happen, but you don't sit and wait to hear a response. It's like just throw some stuff up there and see what sticks. And I have found such value in being still and waiting for him to respond, even if it takes a while. And I like it better than talking. I'll be honest. Like I would rather go and like see what input he has rather than say, here's the issue. Here are the options. I need you to give me A, B, or C. You know what I mean? And I think it probably comes from, we've talked about being on this journey and like continually trying to tear down the boxes that we build around him. And I do that all the time. I'd like to have moved on from that, but it still happens. I just build different boxes. This is what I do. I will tear down a box and I'll build another box. But one of my favorite things to do is actually listen, because that's when I find solutions that I couldn't come up with on my own. So instead of saying, is it option A or is it option B? I say, here's the issue. How are we going to handle this? Or what is the solution? Or what do you have to say about that? And then listen. And oftentimes I get my mind blown because he thinks way higher than I do, and he knows what's to come and he knows what's ideal. And he knows if I'm being moody because I haven't eaten something, you know? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been, I don't know, when I started learning about mystical Christianity, like that probably was one of the biggest changes, was like this practice of, some people call it waiting on the Lord, or some people call it meditating, or a lot of people have a lot of different names, but like just sitting and being quiet until he speaks, like, because then it's not a one-way conversation. Like, I think you're right, like much of the way that I prayed um, before was just like like throwing out something and then just like shutting the door and leaving, being like, okay, great
Right.
conversation. um and it's not that it was like always a one-way relationship, because like I think God is so intent on relationship with you that he will find many ways to speak to you.
For sure.
But I think developing as many of them as you can is super helpful. And listening can be a great one.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, on the other hand, listening uh as a concept in society or in interpersonal relationships, um we've talked a little bit about some of like hot topic issues that are kind of coming up in society and some of the division and stuff. And I think this is something that really plays into some of those uh tough parts of society. um I think it's really easy to have an opinion and share it, um but it's harder to then be quiet and let someone else have a different opinion and be willing to listen, not just to then respond, or react, because we just talked about that too, or to rebut, but listening to one another to understand. And I think that's a really beautiful part of humanity that we have and that we've kind of muted a little bit,
Mm.
And some of these things like political differences, religious differences, uh, I I don't know. What are any other hot topic differences, right? Like, could we get a little further if we would be willing to listen to where the other side is coming from?
Yeah.
Without having to fight. Like,
Yeah.
can we just listen to understand their point of view? You don't have to agree, but can you listen to understand?
Yeah. I think whether it's a relationship with another human or God or like a political thing or a social thing, like the best thing you could possibly do is listen to what the other person is saying. Um, because maybe you'll understand why they're saying it. And maybe that, like, it it takes your like ego and has it take a step back and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
instead of saying I already have a predetermined thought on this action, this belief, whatever it is, like you're saying I'm willing to suspend my judgment until you can explain. And I think that is like, that's a huge thing to do, like if we want to make any difference in society.
Yeah, for sure. I was just reading something, came across some feed somewhere. Actually, I think it was on Pinterest. All of a sudden, I'm more interested in Pinterest because it has less opinions than it's like, here are all the recipes that you're looking for. Terrific. Okay. But I saw something about like, uh, if you do these 5 things, you're probably not emotionally intelligent or something. And I was like, oh, I'm clicking on that. I'm going to read this. But one of the things, like so many of these 5 points were kind of surrounded by this topic of listening. But truly, like to understand someone else, you really do have to be able to sit and allow them to share. And I'm also not the best at this. I'll tell you this. I am married and I have had arguments where I don't even really want to hear the other side. I just want to be right. But was that very like loving? Was it very patient? Was it like any of these nice things, any of these fruits of the spirit that I should have been like working from? It wasn't. Um, but it even talks about how um even just they didn't say listening to one another to understand, but even like with friends and stuff, when friends are going through hard things and always like bringing it back to yourself or like, oh, I understand that I did this, or oh, it's not as bad as when this happened to me. You know what I mean? Like there's some of that that isn't always necessary. I think, I mean, as a human myself, I tend to think sometimes I do need people to, I just need somebody to listen. Just hear me out. I don't really need a solution. I don't really need like huge pity or relating to it. Just sometimes you need a little solidarity,
Yeah.
a little human connection,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think there's moments where, like, I think sometimes people bring up oh, well, let me tell you about the time something similar happened in my life. It's not always like, I don't know, like a dominating, prideful type of thing. I think sometimes it's you trying to connect as best you can to what they're going through. It's your brain
Absolutely.
saying, okay, let's make connections here because that's what your brain's doing all the time. It's recognizing patterns. Um, but often that is received as being super dismissive or um, yeah, or like you just don't care about what they're going through. And
Mhm.
sometimes the best thing you can do is just be quiet.
I know. I've found this with myself too. I don't, there's one certain friend, and I love her so much. Like, she's one of my favorite people. And I find myself doing this when I have conversations with her. And I don't know why. It's like, I'm like, oh, I can relate. Oh, I can relate. When there, I don't really want to make it about me, but for
Right.
whatever reason, I need you to know that you're not alone in this human condition. But I can also see how it could be received as being very like me centered. And I
Mhm.
don't want to be that friend,
Right.
you know? So
Yeah.
if you're my friend and I've done this to you, I'm really sorry. I'm trying to be more aware. And I actually really do value listening.
Yeah.
And I really do value paying attention too. Back to the body language stuff. So I think there's so much that can be communicated um, and picked up on if you are attentive and like actively listening, not passively listening, right? And I'm just bringing out all my dirty laundry, you guys. Oftentimes my husband will be annoyed with me because I will be typing out a message and he will say something to me and I will respond to him as well. But because I'm not making eye contact, it is communicating that I'm not actually paying attention when I am, but I'm also
Mm.
not picking up on his body language and how he's expressing whatever it is he's saying to me.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think there's some of that that happens too. And this is again why emojis are helpful, is because it kind of fills in a little bit of the gaps that you're missing
Yeah. Yeah.
in not communicating face to face.
Yeah. There's something with face to face communication that is really key. And part of face to face communication or effective face to face communication, especially in a marriage or relationship, even like non-romantic relationship, business relationship, whatever it is learning how the other person naturally communicates. Because like you're talking about, like you don't always look at Jason, but yet like, oh, like that's what that's how he receives that I'm paying attention. um, and so it's like sometimes effective communication is um, is communicating the way that the other person receives best, so that you can actually like be on the same page. Because some of it could be like, oh, you're not quite communicating the way that they receive, and then they get sort of like bent out of shape because they don't quite, like they're starting to feel some type of way, and then all of a sudden it gets like the whole thing out of balance when there was never a need for it to be that way ever.
Mhm.
And so like but also like I'm not saying you always have to bend to the way other people do things, but like I think part of effective communication is learning how other people do it. Like paying, like being aware enough that okay, this is how that person communicates.
Sure. Well, and being able to read some of the nuance that the other people have. Like,
Right.
you may have a tilt of your head. This isn't a thing with you, Josh, that I've ever noticed, but you may have a tilt of your head
Right.
that actually is kind of a tell to some response you're having. That
Mm,
if I know you and I have effective communication, I may know that that's indicative of this.
right.
And then that's communicated. And I then know how to continue communicating clearly. Whereas that same tilt of a head may not mean the same thing for someone else. But I think also in those close relationships, we tend to learn each other's body language as well. You know, I have this thing with my sister. Sometimes things happen and we can just like barely look at each other from across the room. It's like, yep, I know exactly what you're thinking and you know exactly what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Communication is happening and it's not telepathic.
It's not quite telepathic. It's not quite verbal, but you know.
It happens.
Yeah.
It totally
Yeah.
happens.
No, it for sure does. And I think that's a sign of like uh, uh of being a good listener because you guys have developed enough of that to be able to communicate without as much like explicit over the top communication. Like when you're talking with someone new or someone who you don't communicate with, you have to be so clear and so precise so that they understand. But as that relationship develops and both of you learn to communicate, it opens up the door for nuances to exist and maybe even less words to exist, and they still understand what you're coming from. And I think a big thing with that happens with humor. Um, if you don't understand the person's humor, then you may pick up on the humor as being like rude or many other things, but you may not pick up on it as being humor. And that like, but as you learn that person and you learn really what they're saying, like you're starting to pick up on like, oh, okay, I know them. I know when they're talking about this, this is what they really mean
Right.
or where they're
Right.
coming from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think I really like what you were saying about learning the other person's language and picking up on their nuance, and you then don't have to have verbal communication, as that's not like always the main source of
Mm,
communication. But I think that lines up so much with relationship with the Lord too. Like if you can get into a practice of listening to him,
mm,
you'll find yourself in places where he's communicating with you and there aren't words, and you just kind of know what he's doing in the moment, and it's just communicated.
yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be verbal, like do option A. Right.
Yeah.
um but there's those nuances, and I think probably maybe I think just every day I get a little more, I don't know, a few more light bulbs that go off in my brain about how much we are alike with him, and we are made in his image, and we actually do function a lot like him. Um if we just get to know him and see how he does it, then it's like, oh, yeah, yep, that applies to like everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I don't know.
Yeah, I think very much so. We're made in his image and we function very similarly. And I think he functions very much, he chooses to function very much like we do to help connect, to help make that connection.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. It makes me wonder what's to come. Like, if at this point in my journey, which I feel like I've gone a long way, until I look ahead and then I'm like, oh, there's so much more.
Yeah.
But if at this point in the journey, I see so many similarities like that, or like even just in this communication that we're talking about, or listening that we're talking about, like how much more is there to be revealed that we can grow into,
Mm,
um and that we have no idea even exists, but will be second nature when it does come, you know?
yeah. I think many of the things, like many of the things that we currently function in pieces. Like I think that it's about the revealing, it's about the growing that helps that, like like we get little tastes of like, oh, this is possible. Like you and your sister, telepathy's possible. Um, but like, but we don't really function in that. But on
Right.
some level, there is an ability for us to function, to communicate non-verbally. We all know that. Most people, I would say, have experienced that. And so I think it's like we have these moments where we are given the opportunity to taste what's really possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's so good. I'm going to really take it into a different direction. And I feel like I just keep stringing this along, but I was just thinking about we've talked about AI quite a bit on the show, not recently, but we have talked about it quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And how we're kind of in this cool place where we kind of get to drive where it goes, determine how it gets used to the extent that it has responsibilities in our lives and all this stuff. But there's some technologies out there already completely widely available that can replicate your voice and make it say whatever is input into
Pretty
the system.
accurately.
Right. Same with video of your face. So your voice with your face. Um, there's all kinds of examples out there that are just silly and goofy. Probably lots of examples that you have no idea it's even being used. But, and we've talked about this before, like the importance of being able to listen and know how to communicate with one another, and knowing that verbal communication isn't 100% of the communication that we do. Because if something like this comes up, if AI is utilized by someone or something and whatever, you'll be able to tell.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I think it was Jesus who said, like, uh, my sheep will know my voice or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? It's something like that.
Yeah.
Um, it's like knowing each other well enough to know what would come out of your mouth or not, what would be communicated and how or not. Would your body actually move like that? Would you tilt your head like that if you were saying that? I don't think you would. You know what I mean? But being able to actually recognize the voice, even if it is in the same voice. And I think that is a skill we're working toward. Like honing in
Yeah.
on that, the essence of one another, as opposed to just the forthright expression.
Mm. I mean, I think that's a huge part of communication, is like the knowing the essence of the person. Just like I was talking about with humor and things, like if you
Mhm.
can't if you can't know who that person is, can you really like actually communicate well with them?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's an interesting thing. Really interesting thing. Makes me think of a few more things, but I'm not going to go there.
Write them down. We'll go there next time.
I know. Okay. Well, thank you guys for
Yeah.
coming along on this journey with us. If you ever
Always.
see a podcast with us where we don't seem to be acting ourselves, maybe contact us a different way.
That's true. Or let us know.
True. Remember, at one time we did an episode where AI wrote the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
and that
And
was fun,
it was like sort of like something we would say, but
but
not
not quite.
quite. And you could tell, like, it's amazing how you can hear someone's voice in writing. Like, you could tell that it didn't sound like us. It
Yeah,
didn't have it, like, it's just amazing, like, the things we give life to. Like, when you write, when we speak, you're giving life to something, and you can tell when it's not you.
it's true. It's that essence.
Yeah, it is that essence. Mm.
That's good. Okay. Here's my challenge to you, Josh, and me, and to the listeners.
Okay.
find someone in your life and see if you recognize their essence.
But
like actually look for it,
Yeah. No, that's good. Look for it in nonverbal ways
Mm-hmm.
and listen to them. If you can't recognize it, spend more time listening.
Good stuff. Okay, Josh, that was really good. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for listening. Keep up with us along this journey by liking, subscribing, and becoming a member through YouTube.
Members get exclusive access to bonus content with our guests, deeper dives into topics, and a look into other projects. We're glad to have you here. See you next time.